I never imagined that a simple wooden fence would turn into the most expensive mistake the Riverside Meadows HOA ever made. But watching their lawyer's face turn white during the settlement hearing made every freezing hour I spent rebuilding it worth the trouble. My name is Brandon Lawrence, and I had lived in my modest ranch house in Casper, Wyoming for 8 years before the HOA decided to make my life a living hell over something that had protected the neighborhood for nearly a decade. The snow fence I had installed back in 2018 was a straightforward structure, nothing fancy, just pressure-treated 4x4 posts with horizontal slats running between them, standing about 6 feet tall and stretching roughly 40 feet along the northern edge of my property. Wyoming winters are no joke, and anyone who has lived through one knows that snow fences are not decorative choices but necessary defenses against the brutal wind that screams down from the mountains and creates drifts tall enough to bury cars. The trouble started on a crisp October morning in 2026 when I was drinking coffee on my back deck, watching the first dusting of snow settle on the distant peaks. A silver Lexus pulled into my driveway, and out stepped Patricia Henderson, the newly elected HOA president, her blonde highlighted hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore expensive athleisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and her smile had that particular quality of someone who enjoyed wielding petty power. "Brandon, good morning," she called out, her voice saccharine sweet. "Do you have a moment to chat?" I set down my coffee mug and walked over, already sensing this would not be a pleasant conversation. Patricia had only been president for 3 months, but in that time, she had already sent violation notices to half the neighborhood for infractions ranging from mailbox colors to grass height during a drought. "What can I do for you, Patricia?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph of my snow fence. Several residents have complained that this structure is blocking their mountain views. According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenants, any structure that materially impacts the viewshed of neighboring properties requires approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I felt my jaw tighten. That fence has been there for 8 years. Nobody said a word about it until you took office. Previous administrations may have been lax in enforcement, but I take my responsibilities seriously, Patricia said, her tone shifting from sweet to stern. "You have 30 days to remove it, or we will take action." "Patricia, that fence prevents snowdrifts from burying my driveway and the road. Without it, the wind coming off those mountains will create drifts 10 feet high. You have lived here, 6 months? You have not experienced a real Wyoming winter yet," she waved her hand dismissively. "I have spoken with several longtime residents who say they manage just fine without unsightly barriers. The fence comes down, Brandon. This is not negotiable." Over the next 3 weeks, I tried everything. I attended HOA meetings with photographs showing the massive drifts from previous winters. I brought in documentation from the county extension office explaining the science of snow fencing and wind patterns. I even offered to paint the fence or modify it to be less visible. Patricia shut down every suggestion with the same response, that the covenants were clear and enforcement was mandatory. On November 18th, I received a certified letter stating that if I did not remove the fence within 48 hours, the HOA would exercise its right to enter my property and remove it themselves, billing me for the costs plus a $500 administrative fee. I called my lawyer, Marcus Chen, who had handled my home purchase years ago. "Do they have the right to do this?" I asked him. Marcus sighed heavily over the phone. "Unfortunately, yes. The covenants do give the HOA the authority to remove non-compliant structures after proper notice. The clause about viewshed is vague enough that they could argue your fence violates it. We could fight it in court, but that would take months and cost you thousands in legal fees. So I just let them tear down something that protects not just my property but the whole street? You could remove it yourself and save the fees they would charge. Then, when the snow comes and causes problems, you would have documentation for a potential lawsuit. It is not ideal, but it might be your best option." I spent the next day dismantling the fence I had spent 2 weekends building 8 years earlier. Each post I pulled from the frozen ground felt like a small defeat. My neighbor to the east, Robert Carlson, a retired engineer in his 70s, came over to watch with a grim expression. "This is madness," Robert said. I remember the winter of 2019. Without your fence, the drifts came halfway up my garage door. I could not get my car out for 3 days. Tell that to Patricia, I muttered, wrestling with a particularly stubborn post. Oh, I did. She told me I was exaggerating and should invest in a better snowblower. Robert shook his head. She bought the old Morrison place up on the hill. From her house, she can see the mountains perfectly. Your fence was never in her view, but Diane Morrison's daughter bought the place next to mine, and apparently she complained that the fence blocks 15 degrees of her panoramic view. Diane Morrison's daughter? You mean Denise Reynolds? Robert nodded. Moved here from California this summer. Works remotely for some tech company. She and Patricia are thick as thieves. By sunset, the fence was gone, the posts stacked in my garage, the slats piled beside them. My property looked bare and exposed. The wind that night howled with a particular fury, as if it knew the barrier was gone and wanted to remind everyone what was coming. November in Wyoming is usually just a preview of winter's real fury. We got a few light snows, a couple inches here and there, nothing that caused serious problems. Patricia sent a smug email to all residents praising the improved aesthetics of the neighborhood and reminding everyone that covenants existed for good reasons. Denise Reynolds posted photographs on the neighborhood Facebook page of the sunset over the mountains, captioned with, "Finally able to enjoy the views we paid for." I did not respond. I just waited and documented everything. I took photographs of my property line where the fence had stood. I kept every email, every letter, every piece of communication from the HOA. Marcus had advised me that if I wanted any chance at recourse, I needed an ironclad paper trail. December arrived with unusual warmth, and I started to wonder if maybe this winter would be mild enough that the lack of snow fence would not matter. Then, on December 19th, the Weather Service issued a winter storm warning that made even veteran Wyomingites nervous. A massive system was pushing down from Canada, bringing high winds and heavy snow that was expected to last 3 days. The storm hit on December 20th at 2 in the morning. I woke to the sound of wind screaming past my windows with a violence that made the whole house shudder. By dawn, 6 inches of snow had fallen, and the wind was gusting to 50 miles per hour. I looked out my front window and watched as the snow that should have been caught by my fence instead funneled directly across my property and into the street. By noon, the drifts had begun. Without the fence to disrupt the wind pattern, the snow piled up with terrifying efficiency. My driveway disappeared under a drift that reached the top of my mailbox. The street in front of my house became impassable, a white wall of packed snow that grew taller by the hour. But the real disaster was developing at Denise Reynolds' house next to Robert's. The specific way the wind came off the mountains and across the valley created a funnel effect right where my fence used to stand. That fence had disrupted the wind pattern, causing the snow to drop in a relatively even distribution across open ground behind the properties. Without it, the wind accelerated through the gap and deposited massive amounts of snow in a concentrated area, which happened to be Denise's driveway, her front yard, and the street directly in front of her house. By the second day of the storm, I counted at least 15 feet of snow piled against Denise's garage door. Her car was completely buried. The drift extended across the entire street, and because her house was on a corner, it also blocked access to 4 other homes. The city snowplows came through twice, but could not keep up with how quickly the drifts reformed without the fence to break the wind. I was struggling to dig out my own driveway when I heard shouting. Denise was standing in her front yard, or what used to be her front yard, screaming into her phone. Her California casual style had been replaced by a puffy parka that looked brand new, and she was clearly not handling the situation well. "I do not care what the schedule is," she yelled. "I have been trapped in my house for 2 days. My groceries are gone. I cannot get to work. You need to get someone here now." She listened for a moment, then shrieked, "What do you mean it could be a week? This is unacceptable." Robert appeared beside me, leaning on his snow shovel. "She is calling every snow removal company in the county. They are all booked solid. Turns out everyone needs help in a blizzard." "Where was her fence supposed to be blocking the view from?" I asked. Robert pointed to Denise's house. "The living room bay window. She claimed your fence cut across about 15 degrees of her mountain view. Now she has a 15-foot snowdrift instead. Karma has a sense of humor. The storm finally broke on the morning of December 23rd. The sun came out, and the temperature dropped to 10 below zero, flash freezing everything into solid ice. The drifts were not going anywhere without serious equipment. I'd managed to clear a narrow path from my front door to the street, but the drift across the road was impassable without a plow. That afternoon, Patricia Henderson's Lexus pulled up as close to the drift as possible, and she got out, picking her way carefully across the icy ground. She wore high-heeled boots that were completely inappropriate for the conditions, and I watched her slip twice before reaching my driveway. "Brandon, we need to talk," she said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I am listening." She glanced back at the massive drift blocking the street. "This situation is unacceptable. The city says they cannot get through with their equipment. Half the street is trapped." "Yes, I'm aware. I am one of the people who is trapped." Patricia's mouth tightened. "The city engineer came out this morning. He said the drift pattern is caused by the wind coming off the mountain without any barrier to disrupt it. He said there used to be a snow fence here." "There was, for 8 years, until you forced me to tear it down." "Brandon, we need you to rebuild that fence." I leaned on my shovel and studied her face. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her makeup smudged. "You want me to rebuild the fence you threatened me with legal action to remove?" "This is an emergency situation. The neighborhood needs that fence." "Interesting. When I said the exact same thing 4 weeks ago, you told me the covenants were non-negotiable." Patricia's voice took on a pleading tone. "Look, I understand you are upset, but people cannot get in or out of their homes. We have elderly residents who need medication. Denise Reynolds missed a crucial work meeting and might lose her job. This is serious." "It was serious when I warned you this would happen. You called me an exaggerator." "I'm asking you to be reasonable." I felt my temper finally break through the careful control I had maintained for weeks. "Reasonable? You want to talk about reasonable? I built that fence with my own money and my own labor to protect my property and, incidentally, everyone else on this street. I maintained it for 8 years, and you ordered me to tear it down because someone who moved here 5 minutes ago did not like how it looked in her vacation snapshots. Now that exact disaster I predicted has happened, and you want me to fix your mistake?" "Brandon, please." "No, you made this decision, Patricia. You own the consequences." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression hardening. "The HOA will pay for the materials. We will even pay you for your labor." "Not interested. We could compel you under the emergency provisions of the covenants." I pulled out my phone and showed her a document Marcus had sent me that morning. According to Wyoming state law and our specific covenants, the HOA cannot force a homeowner to construct a new structure on their property, only remove non-compliant ones. My lawyer made that very clear. You wanted the fence gone. It is gone. We are done here. Patricia turned and walked away, slipping twice more before reaching her car. I watched her drive off and felt a grim satisfaction that immediately mixed with guilt. People were genuinely suffering because of the drifts, including Robert and other neighbors who had nothing to do with Patricia's decisions. But I also knew that if I caved now, the HOA would never face consequences for their actions. Christmas came and went in a state of siege. The main roads were cleared, but our street remained blocked by the massive drift. The city finally brought in a front-end loader on December 26th and carved a single lane through the drift, but within 12 hours, the wind had refilled it with loose snow. The pattern was clear. Without something to break the wind and drop the snow before it reached the street, this would keep happening all winter long. On December 27th, I received an emergency petition signed by 17 households requesting an immediate HOA meeting. The meeting was scheduled for December 30th at the community center, which was one of the few buildings accessible by the cleared main roads. I almost did not go, but Marcus advised me that staying away would look bad if this ended up in court, so I bundled up and made the trek through the cold. The community center was packed with angry, frightened residents. Patricia sat at the front table with 2 other board members, looking like she was facing a firing squad. The meeting started with Patricia trying to go through standard procedures, reading minutes and discussing unrelated business. That lasted about 5 minutes before Robert Carlson stood up and interrupted. "Enough," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years managing construction projects. We are here to talk about the snow disaster, and we are not leaving until we have solutions. Patricia nodded reluctantly. I have been in contact with several snow removal companies. The earliest anyone can provide sustained service is mid-January, and the cost would be approximately $15,000 per month for the rest of winter. The room erupted in angry voices. Someone shouted, "Where is that money supposed to come from?" We would need to implement a special assessment, Patricia said. Each household would be charged approximately $400. $400 because you made a stupid decision? That was Denise Reynolds, standing near the back, her face red. I moved here because I thought this was a well-managed community. Instead, I've been trapped in my house for a week. I lost a major client because I could not make a site visit, and now you want me to pay for your incompetence? Patricia's face flushed. The decision to remove the fence was made according to the covenants. You were the one who filed the complaint. You told me it was a simple matter of covenant enforcement, Denise shot back. You never mentioned anything about snowdrifts or winter problems. If I had known this would happen, I never would have complained. I watched this exchange with fascination. The alliance between Patricia and Denise was crumbling in real time. An older woman named Margaret Davis stood up. Why do we not just ask Brandon to rebuild the fence? That seems like the obvious solution. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly. I offered multiple compromises before the fence was removed. I was told the covenants were non-negotiable. I explained in detail what would happen without the fence. I was ignored. Now Patricia has asked me to rebuild it, and I declined. Why? Margaret asked. People are suffering. Because the HOA created this problem through willful ignorance, and now they want me to fix it for free. I spent $2,000 in 2 weekends building that fence originally. I maintained it for years. The HOA forced me to tear it down, and I lost a full day of work doing that. Now, I'm supposed to spend another $2,000 and more time rebuilding it, with no guarantee that next year Patricia will not decide it violates some other covenant and make me tear it down again. Marcus Chen, who had accompanied me to the meeting, stood up. I represent Mr. Lawrence. The HOA's actions have caused measurable damages to his property value and created a hazardous condition. If the HOA wants the fence rebuilt, we are prepared to discuss terms that would protect my client from future harassment. Patricia looked at the HOA's lawyer, a nervous young man named Todd, something who looked like this was his first real crisis. Todd whispered urgently with Patricia for a moment, then addressed the room. The HOA is willing to offer Mr. Lawrence full reimbursement for materials and labor to rebuild the fence, plus a covenant amendment specifically exempting the snow fence from any future review. Marcus shook his head. Not sufficient. My client also wants compensation for the time and expense of removing the fence, compensation for the property damage caused by the drifts, and a formal apology from the board acknowledging their error in judgment. What kind of compensation are we talking about? Todd asked. Marcus smiled. Given the circumstances, I think $50,000 is reasonable. The room exploded. Patricia was shouting that it was extortion. Denise was yelling that she refused to pay a special assessment to fund my settlement. Robert and several others were arguing that $50,000 was less than the HOA would spend on snow removal for the rest of winter. I let them argue for 10 minutes before standing again. Here is my counteroffer. The HOA pays for all materials for the fence, provides a covenant amendment protecting the fence permanently, and pays me $10,000 for my labor and the removal costs. In exchange, I will rebuild the fence as soon as weather permits. The room went quiet. Todd conferred with Patricia and the other board members. Finally, Patricia spoke. We need to put this to a vote of the full membership. Fine, I said, but every day you delay, the snow keeps drifting, and once winter really sets in, I cannot rebuild until spring. If you want the fence up before February, I need to start immediately after the next break in the weather. The vote was held electronically over the next 48 hours. It passed with 82% approval. Patricia abstained. Denise voted no and sent a furious email to the entire neighborhood calling me a con artist, which Marcus assured me could be grounds for a defamation suit if I wanted to pursue it. On January 3rd, we had a brief warm spell where the temperature climbed to 35 degrees. I spent the next 5 days rebuilding the fence. this time with help from Robert and 3 other neighbors who volunteered their time. The HOA had paid for premium materials, so the new fence was actually sturdier than the original, with 8x8 posts sunk deeper into the ground and additional cross-bracing. We finished on January 7th, just hours before the next winter storm rolled in. This storm was not as severe as the December blizzard, but it was a perfect test of the fence. I watched from my window as the snow accumulated in the field behind my property, caught by the fence, and dropped in even distribution instead of funneling into massive drifts on the street. By morning, the street was passable with just a few inches of snow. Denise's driveway had a normal accumulation that could be cleared with a shovel in 20 minutes. The contrast with the December disaster was stark. I thought that would be the end of it. The fence was up, the neighborhood was protected, and I had received reasonable compensation for my trouble. But Patricia Henderson was not done. On January 15th, I received a notice that my lawn had not been maintained to HOA standards during the fall months, and I was being fined $250. The photographs attached to the notice showed some leaves in my yard from November before the snow fell. Then, I got a notice about my mailbox needing repainting. Then, a notice about my trash cans being visible from the street on a non-collection day, which was false because I always kept them in my garage except on trash day. It was obvious harassment, and Patricia was not even subtle about it. Every few days, a new violation notice would arrive, each more petty than the last. She cited me for a garden hose being left on the side of my house. She claimed my doormat was not an approved color. She said my outdoor light fixtures needed to be replaced because they did not match the neighborhood aesthetic. I forwarded everything to Marcus. After the 8th notice in 3 weeks, he sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, pointing out that the pattern of citations constituted harassment and retaliation. Patricia responded with a formal letter claiming she was simply enforcing the covenants equally across all properties. She is building a paper trail to try to justify these citations, Marcus explained when I called him, frustrated and exhausted. If you fight each one individually, it will cost you thousands in legal fees. But if we can prove a pattern of retaliation, we might be able to get a court order stopping her. How do we prove that? We need evidence that she is targeting you specifically. Can you find out if other homeowners are receiving similar notices? I spent the next week quietly talking to neighbors. What I discovered was infuriating. Patricia had issued a total of 3 violation notices to other properties since becoming president, all minor and all resolved quickly. But she had issued 17 notices to me in 3 weeks. The disparity was impossible to explain as anything other than targeted harassment. Marcus filed a motion for a temporary restraining order against the HOA, requesting that Patricia be barred from issuing any further citations to my property without approval from the full board. The hearing was scheduled for February 10th, but before that hearing could happen, Patricia made a catastrophic mistake. On February 1st, I came home from work to find my mailbox had been removed. Not knocked over, not vandalized, completely removed, leaving just a hole in the ground. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who responded took photographs and told me that several mailbox thefts had been reported in the area recently. That seemed plausible until I checked my security camera footage. I had installed cameras after the harassment started, covering my driveway and front yard. The footage showed Patricia's Lexus pulling up at 2 in the afternoon. Patricia got out, looked around to make sure no one was watching, then used a shovel to dig out my mailbox and load it into her trunk. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes. I called Marcus immediately. He told me to make a copy of the footage and file an additional police report specifically naming Patricia. I did, and 2 officers came to my house that evening to view the footage. Their expressions went from skeptical to shocked as they watched Patricia methodically steal my mailbox. "That is definitely her," one officer said. "Is that a Lexus? What is the license plate?" I zoomed in the footage. The plate was clearly visible. "We will need to follow up with her," the officer said. "This is destruction of property and theft. Federal crime, too, since it is a mailbox." Patricia was arrested the next morning. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Several people who had supported Patricia immediately called for her resignation. The HOA held an emergency meeting on February 4th and voted to remove Patricia from the board entirely, not just as president. But the story got more interesting when the police executed a search warrant on Patricia's home and garage. They found not just my mailbox, but parts from 4 other mailboxes and various items stolen from properties throughout the neighborhood over the past 3 months. Patricia had apparently been conducting a petty theft spree, targeting people she perceived as enemies or obstacles to her vision of perfect neighborhood management. The federal charges for mailbox tampering were serious, carrying potential fines and jail time. But Patricia also faced state charges for the other thefts. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was not interested in being lenient with someone who had abused a position of community trust. The trial was held in late March. I was called to testify about the fence situation and the harassment campaign. Marcus brought in our documentation showing the pattern of violations and the timeline of events. Other neighbors testified about their own experiences with Patricia's increasingly erratic behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Patricia was found guilty on multiple counts of theft and 1 count of federal mailbox tampering. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, and ordered to pay restitution to all the victims. Denise Reynolds sold her house in April and moved back to California. She never apologized, but she did leave a note in my mailbox saying that she had learned a valuable lesson about understanding local conditions before making demands. It was not much, but it was something. The HOA elected new leadership, including Robert Carlson as president. One of their first actions was to pass a comprehensive amendment to the covenants, creating an exception for weather mitigation structures like snow fences, rain gardens, and windbreaks. The amendment specifically referenced the snow fence incident as an example of why practical needs sometimes outweighed aesthetic preferences. The fence stood through the rest of that winter and performed perfectly. Every time a storm came through, I watched the snow accumulate harmlessly in the field behind my property while the street remained clear. It was a simple solution to a predictable problem, exactly as I had tried to explain to Patricia from the beginning. In May, after the snow had melted and spring was turning the mountains green, I was working in my garden when Robert walked over with 2 beers. "Thought you might want to celebrate," he said, handing me one. "Celebrate what?" The HOA got the final bill from our lawyer for dealing with the Patricia situation. $58,000 in legal fees, settlement costs, and restitution payments, plus another $12,000 that we spent on emergency snow removal in January before your fence was rebuilt. I whistled. $70,000 because she did not like how my fence looked. Expensive view, Robert agreed. For what it is worth, I am sorry we did not fight harder when she first came after your fence. A lot of us thought it was not our problem, right up until it became everyone's problem. Lesson learned, I hope, Robert nodded. The new board is implementing a policy that any covenant enforcement action requires a majority vote, not just the president's decision. And any action involving safety or weather mitigation structures requires consultation with the County Extension Office. We are calling it the Lawrence Protocol. I laughed at that. You are naming an HOA policy after me? Well, you earned it. You tried to warn us, we did not listen, and you stuck to your principles even when it would have been easier to just give in. That deserves recognition. We sat in companionable silence for a while, drinking our beers and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold, the same mountains that Denise Reynolds had been so desperate to see unobstructed. The view was beautiful, I had to admit, but beauty does not keep you warm when the wind is howling and the snow is piling up. Function matters more than aesthetics when you live in a place where winter is not a mild inconvenience, but a force of nature that demands respect. The next winter was mild compared to the previous one, but the fence still proved its worth during a January storm that would have created significant drifts. The neighborhood sailed through without incident, and I noticed several other properties on the northern edge installing their own snow fences with the HOA's full blessing. I ran into Todd, the HOA's lawyer, at a coffee shop in March. He had been replaced by the new board but still lived in the neighborhood. That whole situation was my fault, he admitted. I should have researched the practical implications of removing your fence instead of just looking at the covenant language. I was too worried about backing up Patricia instead of giving the board honest advice. Lesson learned? I asked. Definitely. I am working with small-town municipal governments now instead of HOAs. Less drama, better sleep. I understood that sentiment. The months of fighting with Patricia had been exhausting, and even though I had won in the end, the victory felt hollow. I had not wanted to be at war with my own neighborhood. I just wanted to protect my property and maintain a structure that served a legitimate purpose. But sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when it is uncomfortable, even when people call you unreasonable or stubborn. Because if you give in to every petty tyrant who gets a little bit of power, you end up in a world where rules matter more than reason and appearances matter more than function. My snow fence stands today, weathered but sturdy, doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is not pretty, I will admit that. The wood is turned gray, and the whole structure has a utilitarian look that would never make it into a home design magazine. But when the wind comes screaming off those mountains and the snow starts to fly, that ugly fence is the difference between a passable street and an impassable disaster. Sometimes the best view is not the one that looks prettiest in a photograph. Sometimes the best view is seeing your neighbors safe, your street clear, and your community working together instead of fighting over whose aesthetic preferences should take priority. That is a view worth protecting, even if it costs you time, money, and a lot of frustration. The story of my snow fence became something of a legend in Casper. People in other HOA communities heard about it and started questioning their own covenant enforcement policies. A few local lawyers started specializing in HOA disputes, using my case as an example of how not to handle practical versus aesthetic conflicts. Patricia served 13 months of her sentence and was released on good behavior in mid-2028. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Arizona, presumably to a place where snow fences would never be an issue. I hope she learned something from the experience, though I suspect she still sees herself as the victim of an ungrateful community rather than the architect of her own downfall. As for me, I still live in the same house, with the same fence protecting the same street. The HOA and I have a cordial relationship now, based on mutual respect and the understanding that sometimes the best governance is the least governance. They leave me alone, I follow the reasonable rules, and when winter comes, everyone benefits from a decision I made more than a decade ago to prioritize function over form. The mountains still rise in the distance, majestic and beautiful. Denise Reynolds probably has a better view of them from wherever she ended up in California. But I doubt she appreciates them as much as I do, because I understand what those mountains mean. They mean hard winters, brutal winds, and snow that can bury you if you are not prepared. They mean respecting nature instead of trying to prettify it for social media posts. Every time I look at that fence, I think about the cost of standing firm. $10,000, dozens of hours of work, months of stress and legal battles. But I also think about what would have happened if I had just rolled over and let Patricia have her way. The neighborhood would have suffered all winter. Properties would have been damaged. People would have been trapped and endangered. And Patricia would have moved on to her next petty crusade, emboldened by victory and convinced that force and manipulation were legitimate management tools. Some battles are worth fighting, even when everyone tells you to let it go. Some principles are worth defending, even when compromise seems easier. And some fences are worth building, rebuilding, and defending, because they protect something more valuable than views or aesthetics or HOA covenants. They protect people. They protect homes. They protect the fundamental idea that communities should work together to solve problems, not create them in service of someone's narrow vision of perfection. My snow fence is not perfect, but it works. And in the end, that is what matters most. Not how something looks, not whether it fits someone else's ideal, but whether it serves its purpose and makes life better for the people who depend on it. That is the lesson I learned from the whole mess with Patricia Henderson and the Riverside Meadows HOA. That is the lesson I hope others learned too. Function over form, community over ego, practical wisdom over blind rule following. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, with some petty tyrant demanding you tear down something useful for the sake of appearances, remember my story. Stand your ground, document everything, get a good lawyer, and do not give in just because fighting is hard. Because sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth winning. The snow will fall again next winter, the wind will blow, and my fence will stand there, ugly and utilitarian and absolutely necessary, doing its job like it has done for years. That is my victory. Not the settlement money or the legal vindication or even Patricia's conviction. My victory is that simple wooden fence, standing between the wind and my neighbors, proving every single day that I was right and Patricia was wrong. That practical necessity trumps aesthetic preference, that experience and local knowledge matter more than newcomer arrogance. The communities thrive when they respect function over form. The fence stands, the neighborhood is safe, and I can look at those mountains with the satisfaction of knowing that I protected my home and my community from both the weather and from the far more dangerous storm of unchecked petty authority. That view, the view of a job well done and principles defended, is the best view of all, better than any mountain panorama no matter how unobstructed, because it is earned through struggle, validated by time, and built on the foundation of doing what is right even when it costs you everything. My snow fence is my monument, my testament, and my middle finger to every HOA tyrant who thinks rules matter more than reality. It will stand as long as I own this house, and if I have my way, it will stand long after, protected by covenants written in the blood of hard-won legal battles. Let it stand as a reminder that sometimes one person, armed with nothing but common sense and stubborn determination, can face down institutional power and win. Not easily, not cheaply, not without cost. But winning nonetheless, because truth and function and practical necessity will always triumph over vanity and aesthetics and the petty tyranny of small-minded bureaucrats. The fence stands, I stand. And the community learned that standing together for sensible solutions beats following foolish rules every single time. That is my story. That is my victory. And that ugly, beautiful, absolutely essential snow fence is the proof that sometimes the simplest solutions are worth fighting for, no matter how hard the battle becomes.